A man made it to his front door, keys in hand, and died so fast the block barely noticed he'd been murdered. Detective Geathers, tell them what was waiting for you in the dark.
He was dead on his own doorstep with his keys still locked in his fist, half his face torn apart, blood spreading across the concrete beneath him, while the windows above stayed dark and no one inside realized a man had just been executed below them. That was the scene waiting for me in Queens just after midnight. A body at the threshold of home, dropped so quickly and so cleanly, the street around him had already gone still again by the time anyone understood violence had taken place. The first thing I felt was not shock. It was recognition. Not of the victim, but of the shape of the scene. Some murders carry confusion. Some carry noise. This one carried completion. That is what made it terrifying the second I stepped onto that sidewalk. Nothing about it felt interrupted. It felt finished. The man on the ground was not in the middle of a struggle. He was at the end of something that had already gone exactly the way it was meant to. He had closed his bar less than 20 minutes earlier. Same routine, same route, same final walk home. He had likely done it so many times, he no longer thought of it as exposure. That is how routine betrays people. It takes the most vulnerable stretch of their lives and disguises it as safety. By the time he reached his building, he was already home in his mind. His keys were in his hand. His body had stopped scanning. He was no longer a man moving through the city. He was a man crossing the final few feet of a ritual so familiar, he no longer believed anything could touch him inside it. That was when he was killed. There were no defensive wounds, no torn skin across the knuckles, no bruising in the forearms, no evidence he had turned, raised a hand, or even felt another body enter the space behind him. He had not fought because he had not been given time to understand there was anything to fight. 1 second, he was reaching for his lock. The next, he was dead on the concrete, with his blood still warm beneath him. That is what people misunderstand about death. They imagine it arrives with warning. They imagine instinct. Buys you a moment, sometimes it does, sometimes it does not. Sometimes death is so precise, the mind never catches up. This was one of those deaths. He was not attacked. He was removed. The neighbors heard something, but not enough to save him. That detail was almost worse than the body. No one described hearing a gunshot. No one heard panic. No one heard a scream. They described a sound that did not belong, and then silence closing over it almost immediately. A crack, a disturbance. Something wrong, but not wrong enough to drag anyone to a window before it was over. That told me the quiet was not incidental. It was part of the design. And then we got the first thing that made the case feel colder than murder. A woman 2 buildings down heard the sound and glanced out just in time to see a figure leaving the block. Dark clothes, hands at his sides, head down, not rushing, not glancing back, not correcting pace. He was walking. That detail sat in my chest like a blade. Men run when something has gone wrong. Men run when fear enters the body and ruins the illusion of control. But walking tells you something far more disturbing. Walking tells you the act was completed exactly as intended. It tells you the person leaving that block had no need to hurry because nothing had surprised him. No witness, no interruption, no panic, just departure. That was when the murder changed shape for me. It stopped looking like violence and started looking like process.
A man is executed at his own front door, and the killer leaves so calmly he doesn't even bother to run. Detective, what frightened you more in that moment? The killing itself, or the certainty of the man who walked away from it?
The certainty frightened me more, Leonard, because certainty is what turns violence into something colder than rage. Rage is loud. Rage leaves fractures behind. Certainty leaves structure. And structure is what I saw all over that sidewalk. The body had not been taken in anger. It had been taken in sequence. Every part of the scene suggested the same thing. The killer had not encountered this man by chance. He had not argued with him. He had not chased him. He had arrived knowing where the victim would be, when he would be alone, and how long the moment would remain unguarded before the city swallowed the silence again. That is not hatred. That is study. And once that thought settles in, everything becomes more dangerous. Because if the victim was chosen for who he was, then the answer lives in his past, in his enemies, in his debts, in whatever old resentment finally came due. But if he was chosen because his routine made him easy to predict, then the answer does not live in the victim at all. It lives in the mind of the person watching him. That was when the false answers began to arrive, and they arrived fast enough to feel helpful. The victim owned a bar, which meant trouble came attached to him in every direction. A violent former patron with a history of threats, a supplier dispute tied to missing money, a contractor furious over unpaid work, and a public argument weeks earlier. Each lead brought motive. Each one carried the shape of ordinary violence. Each one looked like the kind of anger detectives are trained to expect, and every one of them fit too easily. That was the danger. Real violence is rarely generous enough to explain itself that quickly. But this case laid explanations at our feet almost immediately. One after another, each clean enough to feel plausible, and each convenient enough to become dangerous. False leads do not distract by being absurd. They distract by being believable. So I stopped looking at the men who had reason to hate him and started looking at what the act itself required. He was killed after closing, alone, on foot, within steps of his own front door. That is not random opportunity. That is repeated observation. It meant someone had watched long enough to learn the rhythm, long enough to know when he closed, where he walked, how quickly he moved, when the block emptied, when the windows went dark, and when the body would hit the ground with no one close enough to stop it. That was the first real horror this case gave me. He had not been hunted for who he was. He had been hunted for how predictably he lived.
So when you left that block with suspects already piling up and every easy answer waiting to be believed, what was the one thought that stayed with you?
The thought that stayed with me was the one I did not want to say out loud, because saying it made the city feel smaller, darker, and far less safe. I did not believe we were looking at a man who had simply killed well. I believed we were looking at someone who had learned how to watch, how to wait, and how to step into the safest second of another person's life without ever being seen. And if that was true, then the most disturbing part of what I had just seen was not the body on the sidewalk. It was the possibility that somewhere else in the city, another man was already being studied the same way, already being timed, already being followed through the quiet rituals that made him easy to predict, while the person preparing to kill him was still patient enough to wait for the right night to do it again.
Thank you for watching tonight's episode. Please watch our next episode in the coming days. Have a good night.